want me to tell you about a hero? Fine, but let's get one thing straight before we begin. If you came here looking for some noble knight in shining armor, some chosen one who stands atop a hill with the wind in his hair and a swelling orchestra behind him, you're in the wrong story. Go find someone else. Because Matt Cauthon didn't want to be a hero. He never wanted to be here. He never wanted any of it. He wanted to be in a tavern, rolling dice, stealing pies off a windowsill while the baker wasn't looking. Maybe cheating a fat merchant at cards, then sprinting down the alley before the man realized he'd been fleeced. That was the life. That was the dream. No prophecies, no dark lords, no ancient memories crawling through his skull like worms through an apple. Just dice and laughter, and the warm, golden glow of not being anyone's responsibility. But the Wheel of Time doesn't care what you want. It looked down at this boy, this lazy, grinning, absolutely unremarkable boy from a village so small it didn't bother having a name worth remembering. And it said, You're going to save the world. And Matt said, no thank you. And the wheel said, I wasn't asking. That little conversation between a stubborn boy and the indifferent machinery of fate. Everything else, every battle, every scar, every impossible gamble he survived is just details. Expensive, bloody, terrifying details. But that's the spine of it. A boy who said no, and a universe that didn't hear him. Now, here's the thing about Matt Cauthon that you need to understand before we go any further. He is not brave, not in the way bards mean it. He doesn't feel that warm glow of righteous purpose when he charges into battle. He feels sick, he feels annoyed. He thinks, why me? There are literally thousands of other people who could do this. Why is it always me? And then he charges every single time, cursing the whole way. That's what makes him different. Randall Thor was born to carry the weight of the world. It was written in the pattern before he drew his first breath. He struggled against it, yes, but it was always going to be him. Perrin Aibara was shaped by duty the way iron is shaped by a hammer. Slowly, painfully, but inevitably. Matt was an accident, a cosmic joke. The pattern needed a general, and it grabbed the nearest boy who could throw a stone and talk his way out of a barn. And the boy spent the next 3 books trying to wriggle out of it. And that's what I love about him. That's what makes him the most human character in a story full of channelers and kings and ancient prophecies. Because when you strip away the magic, when you strip away the destiny, what's left is just a person who's scared, a person who wants to go home, a person who looks at the end of the world and says, well, I suppose someone has to do it. Might as well be the idiot with the dice. He is the trickster, the joker in the deck, the one card nobody counted on. Every other champion in this story is a sword or a shield. Matt is the hand that palmed an ace up his sleeve while you weren't watching. He wins not because he's stronger, not because he's more powerful, but because he thinks sideways. Because he cheats. Because he's lucky in a way that makes other men want to put their heads through a wall. And he is greedy. Let's not pretend otherwise. He pockets coins. He eyes the pretty women. He wants the easy way out, the shortcut, the free drink. He is, in every measurable way, a flawed and selfish and deeply unserious young man. But put someone he loves in danger, really in danger, the kind where the light goes out of their eyes if you don't move right now, and watch what happens. Watch him walk into fire. Watch him give up an eye, a memory, a piece of his own soul, and then shrug and say, well, I didn't need both of those anyway. This is not the story of how a boy became a king. He never became a king. And he would have hated it if he had. This is the story of how a boy became exactly what the world needed while spending every single step trying to become something else. It's a long story. It's messy and funny and occasionally so sad you'll want to put your fist through the nearest table. There are dice involved. Lots of dice. There is a black-handled spear, a fox-head medallion, a one-eyed man, a woman who could flay you with a look and then kiss you senseless. There are armies and betrayals and a war at the end of everything. And at the center of it all, there is a boy who just wanted to sit down, roll the bones, and be left alone. So, pull up a chair, pour yourself something. The dice are in the cup, the wheel is turning, and somewhere a fox is laughing. Let's begin. Let me paint you a picture. In the middle of a region so remote, so thoroughly forgotten by the rest of the world, that cartographers occasionally left it blank out of sheer laziness. There was a village called Emond's Field. The two rivers they called the wider stretch of land. No king had claimed it in living memory. No army had ever marched through it, because no army could find it. No tax collector had bothered, because the last one who tried got lost in the forests for 3 weeks and came back half-eaten by wolves. It was, by every meaningful definition, nowhere. And in that nowhere, in a small house with a leaking roof and a mother who wielded a wooden spoon like a cavalry saber, there lived a boy named Cauthon. Matt. Just Matt. He would have been offended if you called him anything longer. Now, if you'd walked through Emond's field on any given morning in spring, you would have seen 3 boys. You couldn't miss them. They were the ones causing trouble. There was Randall Thor, tall, quiet, with that stubborn jaw and those grey-green eyes that always looked like they were carrying some private sorrow he hadn't yet figured out how to name. Rand was the one who helped his father with the sheep, the one who said yes, ma'am, and no, sir, the one who, if a fence needed mending, just went and mended it. No fuss, no complaint. There was Perrin Ibarra, built like he'd been carved out of oak, golden-eyed, soft-spoken. Perrin worked the forge. He could bend iron with his hands and somehow still be gentle enough not to crush a bird's egg. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. You always knew where Perrin was standing because he was standing exactly where he'd said he'd be. And then there was Matt. Matt was the one stealing the apples. While Rand was mending fences and Perrin was hammering horseshoes, Matt was 3 orchards over, up in a tree, filling his shirt with apples he absolutely did not have permission to take. And he wasn't even doing it because he was hungry. He was doing it because old Master Sen's dog had barked at him last week, and Matt Cauthon held grudges with the dedication of a scholar pursuing a lifetime thesis. That was the boy. That was the raw material the universe had to work with. He was his father's son, and that told you everything. Abel Cauthon was a farmer, technically. But Abel Cauthon also ran dice games at every Beltane festival, swapped horses with merchants, and once talked a traveling peddler into selling him a genuine Aiel spear that turned out to be a curtain rod with a pointy end. Abel lost money. Abel won money. Abel never, under any circumstances, did an honest day's labor if a dishonest half-day would suffice, and Matt worshipped him for it. See, in the 2 rivers there was a kind of quiet dignity in hard work. You tilled your field, you sheared your sheep, you baked your bread. You kept your head down and your fences high, and you didn't bother anyone, and no one bothered you. That was the code. That was the way things had been for 1,000 years, probably longer. Matt looked at that code and said, "Yeah, but what if I don't?" Not maliciously. That's the important thing. Matt was never cruel. He never hurt anyone on purpose. But he had this fundamental, bone-deep allergy to responsibility, to expectation, to anyone telling him what he ought to be doing, when he ought to be doing it, and how he ought to feel about it. You told Matt to mend a fence. He'd vanish into the woods and come back at sundown with a fish he'd caught with his bare hands and a story about a talking badger. You told Matt to carry water from the well. He'd do it, but he'd do it by rigging a pulley system out of rope and a bucket and a goat, and the whole thing would collapse and somehow the water would end up on Master. Sen's head, and Matt would already be running. He was chaos. Small scale, low stakes, entirely self-contained chaos. And the 2 rivers tolerated him the way a village tolerates a stray cat that keeps knocking over the milk pails. You sighed. You cleaned up the mess. You locked the door a little tighter. And you let the cat back in tomorrow, because heaven help you, the cat was funny. But here's what you need to understand about Matt Cauthon, and this is the thing that separates him from every other village boy who ever shirked his chores. He wasn't stupid. He was, in fact, terrifyingly clever in a way that made the adults in Emond's field uneasy. He could count cards. He could calculate odds in his head faster than the village schoolmaster could do it with chalk. He could read a person's tells, their hesitations, the little flicker of their eyes when they were about to bluff. By the time he was 14, no one in the 2 rivers would play dice with him unless they wanted to lose, and even then they'd lose anyway because he'd find some new angle. "It ain't cheating," he'd say, pocketing the coins with a grin that could charm the paint off a barn. "It's just being more observant than the other fellow. That's a skill. You should thank me for teaching you a lesson about trust." And then he'd run because the other fellow was reaching for a chair. That cleverness, That sideways, slippery, absolutely infuriating cleverness was the thing that made him dangerous. Not dangerous like a sword is dangerous. Dangerous like a fox is dangerous. You don't see it coming. You turn around and the henhouse is empty and there's a tuft of orange fur disappearing into the bushes and you think, I should have seen that coming. You always should have seen it coming. You never did. And there was something else. Something small. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Something that would matter later when the world caught fire and everyone needed someone who could think 3 moves ahead while the other side was still figuring out move 1. Matt noticed things. Not the way Perrin noticed things, slowly, patiently, the way a blacksmith studies the grain of metal. Not the way Rand noticed things, distantly, as though observing from some far-off tower. Matt noticed things, the way a thief notices things. Instinctively, greedily. His eyes were always moving, always cataloguing. Which door was unlocked, which man was drunk, which merchant was looking the other way. Which path through the woods got you to the village fastest if you needed to disappear in a hurry. He stored it all, every detail, every angle, every possible exit. Not because he was planning anything grand. He was 14. The grandest thing he'd ever planned was sneaking into the tavern cellar for a taste of the brandy. But the architecture was there. The mind was there. A mind built for reading a battlefield the way a card sharp reads a table. Nobody saw it yet. Nobody needed to. Because right now, in this small, forgotten corner of the world, the biggest threat was a harsh winter or a wolf pack straying too close to the sheep. And Matt Cauthon was exactly what he wanted to be. A boy with no responsibilities, no destiny, no prophecy hanging over his head like a blade. Just a boy, and his dice, and the long golden afternoons of a summer that felt like it would never end. He had 2 friends. Rand, who would follow the rules even when the rules were stupid. Perrin, who would carry the weight even when the weight was breaking him. And Matt, who would find a way around the rules, set the weight down, and then pretend he'd been resting under a tree the whole time. 3 boys. 3 ways of being in the world. And none of them, not one, had any idea what was coming. Because out there, beyond the forests, beyond the mountains, beyond everything these village boys had ever known, the world was sharpening its teeth. A man named Moiraine Sedai was riding toward the 2 rivers on a white horse, and she was not coming to admire the scenery. And the Dark One was stirring in his prison, and the pattern was reaching down into this tiny, irrelevant nowhere, and it was pointing a finger at 3 boys, and it was saying, you, and you. And yes, you too, the one trying to sneak out the back door, you especially, but that's the next part of the story. For now, let's leave him here. Matt Cauthon, 14 years old, an apple in his shirt, a grin on his face, running from Master Sen's dog, running from his mother's spoon, running from any future that might ask something of him, running and laughing and not looking back, because once he looks back, he never gets to look forward again. And the thing coming toward him, the dagger, the darkness, the long, terrible road from here to the end of everything, it will need him to look forward. Every step, all the way to the last. But not yet. Not yet. So, the 2 rivers burned. Not all of it. Not the whole village. But enough. Trollocs came. Those twisted, snarling things out of the old stories, the ones mothers used to frighten children with. Go to sleep or the Trollocs will get you. One night, the stories walked out of the dark with axes and torches, and suddenly the bedtime tales had teeth. A woman named Moiraine arrived on a white horse. Said she was Aes Sedai. Said the boys, all 3 of them, were veren, threads the wheel had twisted into the pattern whether they liked it or not. Said they had to run, now, before the next wave came. And just like that, the golden summer ended. And Matt Cauthon, who had never been more than 10 miles from his mother's kitchen, was running into the dark with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. He didn't want to go. Of course he didn't want to go. He wanted to crawl under his bed and pull the quilt over his head and wait for it all to be a bad dream. But the Trollocs were howling, and the barns were burning, and Rand was already running, and Perrin was already running, and so Matt ran too. Cursing, complaining was always the pattern. He'd say no. He'd say he wasn't doing it. And then he'd do it anyway, because the alternative was watching the people he loved die, and some part of Matt Cauthon, the part he never let anyone see, would sooner walk into fire than let that happen. But that's not what this chapter is about. This chapter is about a city and a knife, and the moment a boy reached for something shiny and broke himself open. Shadar Logoth. Say the name slowly. Feel it in your mouth. It sounds wrong, doesn't it? Like a tooth that's gone soft, like a word your tongue doesn't want to make. It was a ruin, a dead city, empty for centuries, swallowed by its own history. Once it had been called Arithmetic. Once it had been proud. But something had happened there, something so vile, so thoroughly evil, that the city hadn't been destroyed by an army or a plague or a war. It had been destroyed by itself, by the suspicion and hatred that had festered in its people like rot in a wound, until neighbor turned on neighbor, until brother turned on brother, until the last living soul in Arithmetic died, screaming in the dark, murdered by someone they'd once called friend. And what was left behind wasn't empty. That's the terrible thing. A pale, drifting, hungry fog that moved through the streets like something breathing. It wasn't alive, not exactly, but it wasn't dead either. It was a stain, a memory of all that hatred, congealed into something that could touch you. And if it touched you, you didn't die, you became part of it. Another whisper in the fog. Another voice saying, "Don't trust them. They're all against you," Moraine warned them. "Don't touch anything, don't take anything, don't so much as look at the treasures in those ruins for too long." The city was poisoned in ways that had nothing to do with the physical. Everything in Shadar Logoth was tainted. Everything remembered what had been done there. And Matt Cauthon, being Matt Cauthon, heard all of this, nodded along very seriously, and then the moment her back was turned, he wandered off. "Now, I want you to understand something. I don't want you to think of what Matt did next as some grand act of defiance. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't even, truly, bravery or stupidity. It was greed. Small, petty, perfectly ordinary greed. He found a room, dust everywhere, cobwebs thick as curtains, and in that room, on a table, in a little leather case lined with faded velvet, there was a dagger. The blade was silver, curved, beautiful, in the way that beautiful things are beautiful when they shouldn't be, when something in your gut tells you to walk away, but your eyes won't let you. And in the hilt, set deep in the metal, there was a ruby, big as a pigeon's egg, red as a fresh wound, and it glowed, not brightly, not warmly. It glowed the way an ember glows in a cold room, the way something glows when it's waiting for you to get closer. And Matt looked at it, and Matt thought, that's worth a lot of coin. That was it. That was the whole thought. "Not. This feels wrong." "Not," Moraine said. "Don't touch anything. Just, that's worth a lot of coin, and I'd look stupid leaving it here for someone else." He picked it up, and the moment his fingers closed around the hilt, something shifted. Not in the room. In him. Like a door opening in a wall he didn't know he had. Like cold water seeping into a crack in the foundation of a house, so slowly you don't notice until the floor is already wet. He put the dagger in his pocket, walked back to the others. Said nothing. "I didn't steal it," he told himself. "I just found it. Finding ain't stealing. Any idiot knows that." And the ruby pulsed against his thigh, warm as a living thing, and smiled. The change didn't happen overnight. That would have been kinder. If he'd woken up the next morning with black veins crawling up his arm and horns sprouting from his forehead, the others would have seen it. They would have helped. They would have dragged him to Moraine and said, "Fix him. Fix him now." But it wasn't like that. It was slow. So slow that you could miss it if you weren't paying attention, if you weren't watching closely. First, the color left him. Just a little. A faintness in his cheeks. A grayish tint under his eyes like he hadn't slept in a week. He told everyone he was fine. He told himself he was fine. He just wasn't sleeping well. That was all. Strange dreams, nothing to worry about. Then the weight began to fall off, not dramatically. A pound here, half a pound there. His clothes started to hang loose. His wrists looked thinner. His cheekbones started to show in ways they hadn't before, and the hollows beneath them deepened like shadows at dusk. Then the coughing started. Dry, the kind that doesn't produce anything but leaves you gasping and tasting copper. And through all of it, through the pallor, the wasting, the coughing, Matt kept the dagger hidden, wrapped in a cloth. Close to his body, always close, the way a miser keeps his gold. He checked on it, touched it, made sure it was still there. And every time he touched it, he felt that little pulse of warmth, and he told himself it was comforting. He told himself it was just a knife, just a pretty knife, nothing to be afraid of. But his eyes were changing. That was the part that scared people if they noticed. There was a sharpness in them now, a wariness. He'd look at you, and his gaze would slide sideways like he was measuring the distance to the door, like he was calculating whether you were a threat, like he was deciding whether you could be trusted, and the answer, increasingly, was no. No one could be trusted. No one. He started to pull away from Rand, from Perrin, from all of them. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow withdrawal, like a tide going out. He'd be in the middle of a conversation, and his eyes would glaze. He'd stop laughing at the jokes. He'd sit a little further from the fire each night, a foot, then 2 feet, then 3, and when they spoke to him, he'd snap. What? What do you want? You think I don't know what you're whispering about? You think I can't hear you? They weren't whispering about him. They were talking about the weather, or the road, or what they'd eat for supper. But Matt heard them. Matt heard them planning, judging, deciding what to do with him. He was sure of it. Certain. The certainty sat in his chest like a stone, cold and heavy and immovable. Perrin noticed first. Perrin always noticed. He had those golden eyes, and they saw things slowly but truly. He looked at Matt one morning, really looked, and his nostrils flared, and he said, very quietly, "You smell like something's dying." And Matt looked at him with eyes like broken glass and said, "Yeah? Well, maybe I'm sick of you sniffing around me like I'm a carcass. Ever think of that? Ever think of minding your own business?" And Perrin, who had never once in his life raised a hand in anger unless he had to, just stood there, hurt, confused, and walked away. Rand was busy with his own apocalypse. The weight of the world was settling onto his shoulders, and he didn't have the space to see what was happening to his oldest friend. And Matt resented him for it. Resented him with a bitter, twisting jealousy that tasted like bile. Of course, Rand gets to be the important one. Rand gets the prophecy. Rand gets the Aes Sedai fawning over him. And I get this. I get a cough and a knife and nobody noticing I'm dying. He didn't think it, not exactly. It was more like a feeling. A cold, crawling, nameless feeling that pooled in his gut every time he looked at Rand and saw the concern in the boy's face and thought, "You don't care. You're just pretending. You'll leave me here when it gets hard." They all will. Dagger pulsed, warm, reassuring. "They don't need you," it seemed to say. "You don't need them. You just need me." And Matt pulled it closer, and stopped eating, and stopped sleeping, and stopped being Matt Cauthon, the boy who stole apples and rigged pulley systems and ran from his mother's spoon. Something else was growing in the space where that boy used to be. Something thin and grey and watchful. Something with a knife in its pocket and suspicion in its heart, and the slow, patient certainty that everyone in the world was an enemy. And the only safe thing was to keep your back to a wall and your hand on the blade. And the worst part? The part that'll stay with you if you let it? He knew. Somewhere deep down, under the paranoia, under the wasting, under the fog that was creeping into his mind like Shadar creeping through the streets of a dead city, he knew. He knew that Dagger was doing this. He knew it was poisoning him. He knew that if he threw it away, if he dropped it in a river and walked until his legs gave out, because the dagger was the one thing that was his. Not Moraine's mission, not Rand's destiny, not the pattern's grand design. Just a knife. Just a ruby. Just one small, shining thing that belonged to Matt Cauthon and nobody else. And if he let go of that, what was left? Just a boy. Just a nobody from a nowhere village, dragged along by forces he couldn't control, expected to smile and be grateful while the world used him up. No, he'd keep the knife. He'd keep it even if it killed him. Because at least it was his choice. At least that was something he decided. That's what the dagger was. Not a weapon, not a treasure, a chain. The first chain. The one that taught him the lesson he'd carry for the rest of his life. You reach for something you shouldn't. You keep it because it's yours, and it eats you alive from the inside out. And you call it freedom. He was 15 years old, and the boy who stole apples was already gone. They saved him. Barely. That's the first thing you need to know about this part of the story. Matt Cauthon did not walk into the White Tower under his own power. He was carried, half-conscious, grey as ash. The dagger still wrapped in a cloth at his hip, warm and patient, waiting for someone to give it back to him. Moraine brought him to Tar Valon. The White Tower, that impossible spire of stone rising out of the island city like a finger pointing at God and saying, "I dare you." The place where women who could channel the one power walked the halls like queens walking through their own gardens. And in a room in that tower, 3 Aes Sedai put their hands on Matt Cauthon's chest and tried to pull the poison out. It wasn't gentle. I want you to understand that. This wasn't some soft golden light washing over him while angelic music played. This was surgery without anesthetic. This was reaching into a wound that had been festering for months and dragging out the rot with bare fingers while the patient screamed. The dagger had grown roots. Fine, dark threads of it had wound themselves through his flesh, his nerves, the deep architecture of his being. Pulling it out meant pulling those threads. And pulling those threads meant pain so total, so absolute, that Matt later said, and this is a direct quote, mind you, he said, "I would have preferred the Trollocs. At least Trollocs just try to kill you. They don't make you feel like your skeleton is trying to crawl out through your teeth. But they did it. The dagger was separated. The rot was cut away." And Matt Cauthon drew a breath. A real breath, deep and clean, the first one in months that didn't taste like copper and grave dirt, and opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling and said, "Right. Am I dead, or is this just another Tuesday? Not dead, not yet, not for a long while yet." But something had changed, and it wasn't just the absence of the poison. It was what had grown in the space the poison left behind. The dice. That's how it started. Not with a bang. Not with a prophecy, not with a burning bush or a voice from the heavens, with dice. A faint, persistent, absolutely maddening sound of dice tumbling inside his skull, rolling and clicking and settling into patterns he couldn't see but could somehow feel. He'd be walking down a corridor in the White Tower, minding his own business, trying to find the kitchens because he hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 weeks, and he was starving, and suddenly, right behind his eyes, like someone rattling a cup of bones in the room next door, except there was no room next door. There was just his skull. And the dice were in it, and they were rolling, and they wouldn't stop. And then he'd turn a corner, and there'd be a puddle of water he almost slipped on, except he didn't slip, because the dice told him. Not in words, not in thought, just in a little tug behind his navel. Step left. And he stepped left. And the puddle was behind him, and he didn't know why that mattered. Not yet, but it always mattered. Always. He played dice in the taverns that night. First night out of the sick room. Legs still shaky, still pale, still looking like a stiff wind would knock him over. And he sat down at a table with 4 merchants and a couple of off-duty tower guards, and he rolled. And he won. He rolled again, won again, 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 7 throws, 7 wins. Not by a little, by a lot, not close calls, not lucky bounces, total, comprehensive, humiliating annihilation of every other person at the table. He threw a 6 when he needed a 6. He threw a 2 when he needed a 2. The dice obeyed him like well-trained dogs, like they'd been waiting their whole wooden little lives for someone to give them orders. And the men at the table stared at him, and Matt stared back, and the dice in his head went quiet, satisfied, like a cat that's just knocked the last glass off the shelf. "I ain't cheating," he said, which was technically true because he wasn't. "I'm just having a good night." He was not having a good night. He was having every night. From that point forward, every time Matt Cauthon put his hand near a pair of dice, a card table, a game of chance in any form, shape, or configuration, he won. Not always. Not every single throw. Enough that it stopped being luck and started being something else. Something structural. Something woven into the pattern of his life so tightly that you couldn't separate the winning from the man. He hated it. He didn't hate the money. He loved the money. He loved the coins clinking into his palm, the way the other players' faces went slack and disbelieving, the way they'd say, "One more round, just one more," and lose again. He loved it. He was Matt Cauthon. He loved winning. But he hated what it meant. Because winning meant the pattern had its hooks in him. Winning meant the wheel was spinning him where it wanted him to go. Winning meant he wasn't free. He was just a dice in someone else's cup, being rolled toward a number he hadn't chosen. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, pocketing the coins. "I didn't ask for any of this. I want to go home. I want a hot bath and a pie, and for everyone to leave me alone." The dice clicked, softly, almost fondly, as if to say, "Not yet, love. Not yet." Because luck was one thing. Luck was passive. Luck was the universe tilting the table so the ball rolled your way. You didn't have to do anything. You just had to be there when it happened. But the stick was something else. The stick was him. There was a practice yard in the White Tower, a wide, flat, dusty square where the warders trained. Those silent, lethal men bonded to the Aes Sedai, warriors who moved like water and hit like avalanches. They trained with practice swords, wooden staves, quarterstaffs. And around them, sometimes, the young men who'd come to Tar Valon with Aes Sedai would spar. Gawyn Trakand, Galad Damodred, boys with noble blood and expensive training and the kind of polished technique that takes years of private tutors to develop. Matt watched them for a while, leaning against a post, arms crossed, looking unimpressed. And then someone tossed him a stick, just a length of ashwood, roughly shaped, about the length of a man's arm. And they said, "Go on then, have a go." And Matt Cauthon, who had never received a single lesson in swordplay, who had never held a proper weapon in his life, who had spent the last 4 months being slowly digested by a cursed knife, Matt Cauthon picked up the stick, and something happened, something that had nothing to do with luck. His body knew, not his mind. His mind was confused. His mind was saying, "What the hell am I doing? I'm going to get my teeth knocked in." But his body, his hands, his feet, his hips, the turn of his shoulders, his body knew. His body moved. And it moved in ways that Galad and Gawyn, with all their years of training, could not predict, could not read, could not counter. Because Matt didn't fight like a swordsman. He didn't fight like a warder. He fought like a street brawler. Like a boy who'd spent 14 years dodging his mother's spoon, scrambling over orchard walls, and running from dogs. His style was chaos. It was sideways. It was wrong by every rule of formal combat. He'd feint low and strike high. He'd step into a blow instead of away from it. He'd use the butt end, the middle, the flat of the stick in ways no instructor would ever teach because no instructor would ever think of them. He hit Galad first. A crack across the ribs that made the beautiful, perfect, insufferable Galad Damodred double over with a look of pure, undiluted shock on his aristocratic face. Sweep of the legs, a tap on the wrist that sent the practice sword spinning away, and a gentle, almost mocking, poke to the throat. "Yield," Matt said, grinning, because he couldn't help it. Because his body was singing. Because for the first time in months, he felt awake. And the practice yard went quiet. Because Galad Damodred did not lose. Galad Damodred was the finest young swordsman in the White Tower. Galad Damodred was the kind of fighter you watched and thought, "I will never be that good, not in 100 years." And a half-starved village boy with a stick had just put him on his back. Matt looked down at the stick in his hand, looked at Galad still on the ground, still blinking, looked at Gawyn still holding his wrist where it stung. "So?" Matt said. "Anyone else want to go? Or can I go find the kitchens now? I've been starving for 3 weeks and I think I deserve a bloody pie." He didn't understand it. Not then, not fully. He thought it was just instinct, adrenaline, the leftover twitchiness of a body that had spent months fighting for its life against the dagger's poison. He told himself it wouldn't last. He told himself it was a fluke. But it wasn't a fluke. It was the first crack in the wall, the first glimpse of what was behind it, because the pattern hadn't just given Matt Cauthon luck. It had given him something else, something that hadn't activated yet. Something that was still sealed, still waiting, still sleeping in the back of his mind like a dog waiting for its master to come home. But that's the next chapter. That's the doorframe. That's Rhuidean. And that's where things stop being funny and start being irreversible. For now, just picture him. Matt Cauthon, standing in the practice yard of the White Tower, stick in one hand, coins in his pocket, dice rolling in his skull, grinning like an idiot because for the first time since Shadar Logoth, he doesn't feel like he's dying. He feels like he's starting, and the wheel turns, and the pattern tightens. And somewhere, in a desert no one from the two rivers has ever seen, a doorframe stands waiting, with answers, with memories, with a price that hasn't been named yet. But Matt doesn't know that. Not yet. Right now, he's going to find the kitchens. He's going to eat 3 pies. He's going to roll dice until the tavern throws him out. And he's going to pretend, just for one more night, that the sound in his head is just a game. Just a game. Just dice. Just luck. There is a city in the Isle Waste that shouldn't exist. Not because it's impossible. Not because it's hidden. But because everything about it is wrong. The geometry is wrong. The silence is wrong. The way the light falls through its streets, golden and thick, like honey poured over old bones, wrong. It sits in the middle of a desert that wants to swallow it, and it refuses to be swallowed. It has been refusing for 3,000 years. Rhuidean, the city of dawn, the city, the Aiel, fear more than death. And Matt Cauthon walked into it because Rand was walking into it, and Perrin was walking into it, and everyone was walking into it, and Matt, being Matt, said, "I am not going in there, you're all mad. I'm going to sit right here in the shade and wait for you to come back out." And then he went in. Because of course he went in. Because sitting outside while his friends walked into a place that might kill them was not actually an option. Not for him. Not ever. Not really. He just needed to complain about it first. That was the ritual. That was the price of admission. One round of, I hate this, I hate this, I hate this, and then you did the thing. The doorframe. It stood in the center of the city. Not a door, not a wall, just a frame. 3 sides of twisted dark metal, standing alone in an empty plaza with nothing behind it. No doorway, no room, just the frame, and the air inside it which shimmered, which breathed, which looked at you. If a patch of empty air can look at you and said, "Are you sure? Are you absolutely, positively, 100% sure? Because what's in here doesn't give refunds." And Matt stared at it, and the dice in his head went absolutely berserk. Not clicking, not rolling, screaming. A sound like 1,000 bones rattling in 1,000 cups, all at once, all frantic, all saying the same thing, don't, don't, don't. He went in anyway, because Rand was in there. Because if Rand could walk through that frame, then Matt could walk through that frame. Because he was not going to be the one who stood outside and waited and let his best friend face whatever was on the other side. Alone. Fine, he said. Fine. But if I come out of this as a newt, I'm blaming you. I'm blaming all of you. I'm blaming the wheel. I'm blaming my mother. I'm blaming that bloody dagger. I'm blaming everyone. And he stepped through. I can't tell you exactly what was on the other side, because Matt couldn't either. Not clearly. Not in a way that made sense when he tried to put words to it later. But he tried. He sat by a fire days later with a 1,000-yard stare and a cup of something strong in his hands, and he tried. It's like, you know when you're falling asleep, and you feel like you're sinking, and the room goes soft, and the edges blur, and you can't tell where your body ends and the bed begins. It's like that, except you never hit the bottom. You just keep sinking. And while you're sinking, things look at you. Things that don't have faces, but somehow are looking. And they ask you questions, and you answer, and you don't know why you're answering because you didn't decide to. Your mouth just opens. The eelfin, the snake folk and the fox folk, old things, older than the AL, older than the breaking, older, maybe, than the wheel itself. They lived in the spaces between worlds, between moments, between the cracks in reality where things leaked through, and they collected. They collected questions, they collected answers, they collected people. And they gave Matt 3 things. 3 answers to 3 questions he didn't remember asking. 3 gifts he didn't remember requesting. 3 prices he didn't remember agreeing to pay. The first, shaped like a fox's head, silver. Cold. Cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Cold in a way that meant nothing can touch you. No channeling. No power. No invisible threads of Sedin or Shadar wrapping around your throat. You wear this, and you are outside the reach of magic. Alone. Unreachable. Free. The second, a spear. Ashandari, they called it. The Aiel called it that. But the thing itself had an older name. The one that appeared on its black shaft in letters of pale fire, Mahalania, he who rides the dawn, forged in the age of legends, older than nations, older than war. A weapon that hummed when you held it, like it was alive, like it was happy to be held again after 3,000 years in the dark. The third was the worst. The memories, they didn't come gently. They didn't come one at a time, polite little packages you could open at your leisure. No, they came like a flood, like a dam breaking. Like someone had taken the entire history of human warfare. Every battle, every siege, every ambush, every desperate last stand fought by every general who ever lived in the 3,000 years since the breaking, poured it all at once, into the skull of a 16-year-old boy from a village that didn't have a proper inn. He saw them. Not as stories, not as images on a page. He lived them. He was a general on a hilltop, watching 10,000 men charge across a plain, and he knew in his bones, in his gut, in the particular set of his shoulders, that the left flank would break in 30 seconds, and he had to shift the reserve now, or the line would collapse and the river would be red by sundown. He was a captain in a besieged city, 3 months without food, and he was deciding which of his soldiers would eat today and which would not, and the weight of that decision was a physical thing pressing on his chest. Like a stone. He was a scout in enemy territory, belly flat in the mud, counting torches, calculating how many men they represented, and whether he could make it back to his own lines before dawn, and whether it mattered, because even if he made it back, the information might already be useless. He was all of them. Every single one. Hundreds, thousands. A chorus of dead men, all speaking at once, all saying, "Here. Here. This is how you hold a line. This is how you break a charge. This is how you sacrifice 300 to save 3,000. This is how you lose. This is how you win. This is how you lie awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if you sent them to die for nothing." And underneath it all, underneath the tactics and the formations and the logistics, there was something else. Something smaller, something that cut deeper than any blade. The loneliness. Every single one of those generals was alone, not physically. They had armies. They had staff. They had kings and queens breathing down their necks. But the decision, the moment when you look at the map and you move the piece and people die because you moved it wrong, or people live because you moved it right, that moment was always solitary. No one could share it. No one could help. You stood at the center of a web of lives, and every thread led back to your hand, and if your hand shook, the thread snapped. Matt felt that. Felt it settle into him like sediment. Like silt filling a riverbed, slow, inevitable, permanent. And he screamed. Not a heroic scream, not a defiant roar. A small, thin, terrified sound. The sound a boy makes when the world gets too big and too loud and too heavy, and he just wants to go home. When they pulled him out of the doorframe. Because he couldn't walk out himself, he couldn't move himself. His legs had forgotten how. They saw the mark on his neck. A line. Thin, red, raw. Like a rope had been drawn tight across his throat and held there long enough to leave its signature in the flesh. He had died in there, briefly. A moment, long enough for the wheel to say, "You are mine, you were always mine, and now you know what I paid for you." He touched the mark, ran his finger along it, felt the raised skin tender and new. "Well," he said. His voice was hoarse, scraped. Like he'd been screaming for a long time and only just stopped. "At least it's not a beard. My mother would have hated a beard. No one laughed. No one could. Because they could see it in his eyes. The boy who walked into that doorframe was not the man who walked out of it. The boy had been scared and confused and angry and young. The man who came out was all of those things still. But he was also old. Old in a way that had nothing to do with years. Old in the way that only the dead get to be old, because he had carried them. Because they were in him now, riding him, wearing his skin like a coat, looking out through his eyes with 1,000 sets of dead eyes, calculating odds and counting casualties and planning maneuvers that wouldn't exist for another war, in another country, another century. And here's the thing nobody tells you about Matt Cauthon, the thing that makes him more than just a lucky gambler with a spear and a smart mouth. He didn't break. He should have. Any reasonable person would have. You take a 16-year-old boy and you pour 3,000 years of warfare into his head, and you kill him for 30 seconds, and you hand him a magic spear and a fox medallion, and you say, "Congratulations, you're a general now." And any reasonable person would have gone mad, would have crawled into a corner and stayed there, would have screamed until the screaming stopped meaning anything. Matt didn't do that. Matt touched the scar on his neck. Matt looked at the spear in his hand and said, "Right, so I suppose this means I can't go back to stealing pies then." And then he got up, and he found Rand, and he found Perrin, and he said, "Right, what's next? Where are we going? Who's trying to kill us this time? Because I'd like to get a head start." And the generals in his head, the hundreds of them, the thousands, the dead men with their maps and their plans and their lonely midnight vigils, they looked at this boy. This impossible, grinning, stubborn, infuriating boy. And they thought, collectively, in a voice like wind through a battlefield, "He's mad. He's absolutely mad, but he'll do." And Matt thought back, just once, just for a moment. I'm still me. I'm still Matt. I'm still the one who steals pies and cheats at cards and runs from his mother's spoon. I'm still me. Put their memories in my head. They can make me see their wars. They can make me feel their loneliness. But I'm still the one who decides what to do with it. I'm still the one holding the stick. I'm still the one rolling the dice. He said it like a prayer, or a dare, or a challenge thrown at the feet of every dead general in his skull. I'm still me, and I'm not done being me yet. The dice rolled, softly, gently, like a hand on a shoulder, like something saying, "Yes, you are. You're still you. Now get up. There's work to do." And Matt Cauthon got up and kept walking and didn't look back at the doorframe. He never looked back, not once, not then, not ever, because looking back meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling, and feeling meant admitting that somewhere in those 3,000 years of memories, in those hundreds of lonely generals and desperate last stands and 3 a.m. vigils over maps that never seemed to have the right answer, somewhere in all of that, there was a part of him that recognized it, that wanted it, that looked at the weight of command and thought, not, "I hate this," but "This is mine." And he couldn't admit that. Not yet. Not for a long time yet. So he kept walking, and he kept grinning, and the generals in his head kept their silence, and waited, and planned. The boy was still in there, but he wasn't alone anymore. He was never going to be alone again. Here's the thing about Matt Cauthon after Rhuidean. He had 3,000 years of military genius rattling around in his skull like loose change in a pocket, and his singular, burning, absolute priority was to never, under any circumstances, use it. He wanted to run. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. Get away from the Isle Waste, get away from the prophecies, get away from the Aes Sedai and their schemes and the Dark One and his shadows and Rand and his destiny with a capital D that hung over every conversation like a bad smell. Find a town, find a tavern, find a table with dice on it, sit down, never get up. That was the plan. And for about 3 days, he almost managed it. Almost. He was heading north, away from the waste, away from the fighting, away from anything that smelled like a war. And on the 3rd day, he came over a hill and saw a column of soldiers, maybe 200, tattered, starved, walking with the hollow-eyed shuffle of men who'd been losing for so long they'd forgotten what winning looked like. And behind them, about half a mile back, a cloud of dust that meant cavalry. Enemy cavalry, coming fast. And Matt looked at them, and the generals in his head went quiet. Not silent. Quiet. The way a room goes quiet when someone walks in and everyone knows something is about to happen. And one of them, just one, a voice like gravel and old iron, said very softly, "The terrain favors a defile to the east. 200 men in a bottleneck holds 1,000. The slope on the left is too steep for horses. Funnel them, break the charge, counter with the reserve on the right flank." And Matt said, "No." And the voice said, "They will die." And Matt said, "Not my problem." And he turned around, started walking the other way. Fast, not running. Not yet, but fast. And he got maybe 200 yards before he heard the first scream. Distant, thin. The sound of a man who knows he's about to die and is just surprised it's happening so soon. And Matt stopped. And Matt stood there with his back to the battle and his eyes closed and his fists at his sides and the dice in his head rolling so hard his skull felt like a drum. And he turned around. And he walked back. And he opened his mouth, and what came out was not Matt Cauthon, the boy from Emond's field. What came out was something else, something older, something with 3,000 years of command in its voice, and the absolute, unquestionable authority of a man who has sent 10,000 men to die and live to do it again tomorrow. You with the broken standard, get your archers to that ridge, not the top, the slope, 30 degrees. You want them firing down into the charge, not across it. You with the spear line, funnel left, into the gully. They can't wheel horses in a gully. Take 20 men, go wide right, wait for the horn. When the horn blows, you hit them in the flank. Not before. Wait for the horn. And the soldiers, starving, broken, leaderless soldiers who hadn't won a battle in 6 weeks, looked at this scrawny kid with a black spear and a scar on his neck and a look in his eyes like he was personally offended that they were losing. And they listened. They listened because his voice didn't ask, didn't suggest, didn't plead. It told. It told them the way the ground told water which direction to flow. The way gravity told stones which way to fall. There was no argument in it, no room for doubt, just direction, just certainty, just a voice that said, "I know what comes next and I know how to survive it, and I am going to get you through this if I have to drag every one of you by the collar." And they won. Of course they won. The generals in his head had been winning battles since before the breaking. The terrain did what he said it would do. The cavalry funneled into the gully. The archers raked the slope. The flank hit like a hammer. And in 20 minutes the dust cloud was gone, and the enemy was running, and 200 starving soldiers were staring at Matt Cauthon like he'd just pulled the sun out of the sky. And Matt looked at them, and he said, "Right, good, lovely, wonderful. Now I'm going the other way. Good luck. Don't die. Try not to walk into any more cavalry." And he turned around, and he walked away, and they followed him. Of course they followed him. That was the pattern. That was the whole miserable, inescapable pattern of the next 6 months. He'd run. He'd get 2 days' distance from the nearest army, and then he'd find a village being raided, or a column of refugees being hunted, or a garrison holding a bridge with 30 men against 300, and the commander was dead, and the sergeant was crying, and no one knew what to do. And Matt would look at them, and the generals would whisper. And Matt would say, "No, absolutely not. I'm not doing this. I'm going to find a tavern." And then he'd do it, every single time. He'd open his mouth, and the words would come out, and the battle would be won, and the soldiers would look at him with those eyes, the ones that said, "You saw us. You actually saw us, and you didn't walk away." And they'd follow. And he couldn't make them stop. "You don't have to follow me. I'm not a general. I'm not your lord. I'm not your bloody king. I'm a man looking for a tavern and a hot bath, and for all of you to go find your own wars to fight." And they'd nod. Then 100, then 200, then 500, and somewhere in the middle of all that, someone painted a red hand on a banner, and someone else stitched it onto a coat, and someone else started calling themselves Of the Red Hand, and the name stuck, because names always stick when they mean something, and this name meant, "We follow the man who doesn't want to be followed, and that's why we die for him." the band of the Red Hand, born not in a war room, not in a palace, born in the dirt, on the road, out of 100 small rescues by a boy who kept saying, "I'm not doing this," while doing exactly that. And here's what made them love him. Because it wasn't the victories. Any lord can win battles if he has enough men and enough gold. That's not loyalty, that's employment. What made them love him was this: Matt Cauthon ate with them, not near them, not among them, at a separate table with a nicer cloth and a better cut of meat. With them, same pot, same bread, same thin, greasy stew that tasted like it had been boiled in a boot. He sat in the mud with them. He cursed the weather with them. He played dice with them, and lost on purpose sometimes, though they never knew it was on purpose, and he'd deny it to his grave, because a man who wins every hand at every table stops being a person and starts being a monument, and Matt didn't want to be a monument. He learned their names, not the officers, not the sergeants, the men. The ones who carried the spears and dug the trenches and died in the mud while the lords argued over strategy in warm tents. He knew that Tom's wife was sick back in Camelin. He knew that Birgit's son had been born while she was on the march. He knew that old Davin couldn't sleep without a fire because of the nightmares from the borderlands. He knew, and he remembered, and he asked. Every morning, "How's Tom's wife? Did Birgit get the letter? Is Davin sleeping?" And the men heard that. The men felt that, because no lord had ever asked. No general had ever cared whether the men in the back of the line could sleep. No commander had ever sat in the mud and said, "Right, pass me that bread, and if you've got any of that terrible ale, I'll take it, because it's better than nothing, and nothing is what we had yesterday." Have died for him. Not because he ordered them to, not because of duty or honor or the pattern, because he was theirs, and they were his. And that was enough. That was everything. And through all of it, through the running and the fighting and the reluctant commanding and the mud and the blood and the endless, exhausting, goddamn responsibility of it, there was Rand. Rand Althor. The dragon reborn. The man the whole world was watching. The man who could channel Sedin and call lightning from a clear sky, and who was slowly, visibly, terrifyingly losing his grip on the one thing that kept him human, the memory of being a shepherd from the two rivers. And Matt was the only person in the world who could say to him, "Rand, you absolute wall-headed idiot. You can't just burn the city. You can't. I don't care what the prophecy says. I don't care what the voices tell you. You can't burn the city because there are people in it, Rand. Actual people, with faces, and children. And they didn't do anything. You can't." And Rand would look at him, and for a moment, just a moment, the madness would recede, just a crack, just enough light to see through. And Rand would say, "They'll die anyway. The pattern demands." And Matt would say, "Bugger the pattern. The pattern can find someone else. You're not the pattern right now. You're Rand Althor from Emond's field, and you used to cry when a lamb got caught in the fence, and you are not burning this city. Do you hear me? You are not." And Rand wouldn't burn the city. Not that night. Not then. And maybe not ever, because Matt was there. Because Matt was always there, standing between Rand and the abyss. Not with power. Not with channeling. Not with prophecy. Just with a voice. A stubborn, profane, absolutely unimpressed voice that said, "I knew you before you were a legend. I knew you when you were a boy who couldn't whistle. And I'm not letting that boy die. Not while I'm standing here." That was what Matt was to Rand. Not a general, not a weapon, not a tool of the pattern. An anchor. A rope tied around the waist of a man standing on the edge of a cliff saying, "You can lean out. You can look down. You can feel the pull. But I'm holding the rope. And I'm not letting go. And I will drag you back by your bloody teeth if I have to." And so the months passed, and Matt Cauthon, who had wanted nothing more than a tavern and a hot bath and to be left alone, found himself at the head of a column of men 5,000 strong, riding north toward the next fight, the next battle. The next time the generals in his head would whisper and his mouth would open and the words would come out and people would live or die because of what he said. He hated it. He hated every morning when he woke up and remembered he was in charge. He hated every map he unrolled. He hated every council of war where men in armor looked at him and waited for him to speak. He hated the weight of it. The knowledge that every order he gave was a life he was spending, that every clever maneuver was someone's blood on his hands. "I didn't want this," he said once, late at night, to the fire, to the dice in his head. "I didn't want any of this. I wanted to go home. I wanted to sit on the porch and watch the sun go down and not have a single person's life depending on whether I made the right call." The dice rolled, softly, almost gently. And the voice, the old voice, the gravel and iron voice, the first general who'd ever spoken to him in Rhuidean, said, "No one wants it, boy. That's what makes you fit for it. The ones who want it are the ones you need to worry about. You don't want it, and so you'll never spend a life cheaply. You'll never waste them. You'll never send them into the fire because it's convenient, or because it looks good on a map, or because some king told you to. You'll spend them because you must, and you'll hate every single one. And that hatred is the price. That's the price of command. You pay it in sleep, in peace, in the part of you that gets to be a person instead of a weapon." And Matt stared at the fire. And he said very quietly, "That's a terrible price." And the voice said, "Yes, it is." And Matt picked up a stick, poked the fire, watched the sparks rise, and he gave the orders, and the men followed, and the Red Hand marched. And Matt Cauthon, who never wanted to be a general, was the best one the world had seen in 3,000 years. Not because he was brilliant, not because he was chosen, not because the pattern needed him, because he cared. And that was enough. That was always enough. Let me tell you something about Rand al'Thor that nobody else will. By the time the world knew his name, by the time the banners were flying and the prophecies were being fulfilled and the Aiel were kneeling and the Aes Sedai were whispering behind their hands, by the time all of that happened, Rand al'Thor was already disappearing. Not dying, not yet. Something worse than dying. He was being replaced, layer by layer, memory by memory. The shepherd was going. The boy who used to get sheep dung on his boots and complain about it was going. The boy who couldn't whistle, who tried and could only ever produce a sound like a dying goose, that boy was going. And in his place, something else was growing. Something vast, something cold. Something that looked at cities and saw strategy, looked at people and saw resources, looked at the sky and saw the Dark One's prison, and nothing else. Nothing else at all. Everyone saw it happening. The Aes Sedai saw it. Mean saw it. The Wise Ones saw it. They saw the change in his eyes, the hardening of his jaw, the way his voice went flat and distant, like he was speaking from very far away. Like the man standing in front of you wasn't quite in his body anymore. Like he was up in the sky somewhere, looking down, making calculations. They saw it. They did nothing. Because what could they do? He was the Dragon Reborn. He was the pattern's champion. He was the man who had to face the Dark One at the end of everything. You don't grab the pattern's champion by the shoulders and say, "Hey, stop being a vessel for cosmic forces and start being a person again." You don't. You bow. You serve. You wait. You pray. One person grabbed him by the shoulders. One person looked at the Dragon Reborn, the man the whole world was kneeling to, and said, "Rand, you look like hell. When's the last time you ate something that wasn't bread and cheese? And don't you dare tell me you don't have time. I don't care if the Dark One is knocking on the door. You sit down, you eat a proper meal, and you let me pour you a drink, or I swear on my mother's wooden spoon I will knock you out and drag you to the kitchen myself." That person was Matt Cauthon, and he did not care that Rand was the Dragon Reborn. He did not care about the prophecies, or the fact that Rand could channel enough Sedin to level a mountain range. He cared that Rand hadn't eaten in 2 days. He cared that Rand's eyes looked like they hadn't blinked in a week. He cared that the boy he'd grown up with was vanishing inside a god, and he was goddamn going to do something about it. Here's how it worked. This thing between them. Rand would be in a council room, lords and generals and Aes Sedai all talking, all planning, all looking at Rand with that careful, terrified respect. The kind of respect that makes a man feel like he's standing on a pedestal. The kind that separates you from every other living soul in the room. The kind that says, you are not one of us, you are above us, you are the dragon, and we are just people. And Rand would sit at the head of the table, and he would feel the distance growing, the gap widening, the room getting smaller and himself getting larger, until he was too big for the room, until the room was just a box around him, until the people in it were just figures on a map, just pieces to be moved. And then the door would open, and Matt would walk in, late, uninvited, probably smelling like horse and cheap ale. And he'd drop into a chair at the far end of the table, put his boots up on the polished wood, and the generals would flinch, because you don't put boots on the war table, you don't. And Matt would say, right, I've been thinking, and I think this whole plan is absolute rubbish. You're going to lose the eastern flank because you're trying to hold too much ground with too few men, and the moment they hit the river crossing, the whole thing folds like a wet napkin. You need to pull back. Give them the ground. Let them come to you. Fight them on the ridge where the horses can't maneuver. And the generals would stare, and the Aes Sedai would stiffen, and Rand would look at Matt. And for one moment, one single, fragile moment, the dragon would recede, and the shepherd would come back. And Rand would say, you can't just give them ground, Matt. The supply lines. And Matt would say, bugger the supply lines. The supply lines are a problem for the supply line people. You're a general right now, not a quartermaster. Fight the battle, not the logistics. And for the love of all that's holy, stop sitting like that. You look like a statue. Move, breathe, be a person. And Rand would blink, and something in his face would shift, just slightly. Just enough. The mask would crack, the distance would close by an inch, and he'd say, fine, the ridge, but if we lose the crossing. And Matt would grin, that grin. The one that said, I got you. You're not alone in this room. You're not the dragon right now. You're Rand, and I'm Matt. And we're arguing about tactics like we used to argue about whether the Senza's apples were better than the Althor's, and that's fine. That's normal. That's real. And Rand would almost smile. Almost. And the council would continue. And the generals would look at Matt with a mixture of horror and grudging respect. And the Aes Sedai would file it away for later. The dragon's weakness, his attachment to this village boy, perhaps it can be used. And Matt would catch them looking and give them a stare that said, I see you. I see what you're doing. And if you try to use him, I will find you, and I will not be polite about it. But it wasn't always funny. It wasn't always a joke or a quip or boots on the war table. There were nights, late nights, when the camp was quiet and the fires were low and Rand couldn't sleep because the dreams were bad. Not nightmares, worse than nightmares, visions, the Dark One's voice in the back of his skull. The feeling of Sedin calling to him, always calling, a hunger that never filled, a fire that never went out. And he'd sit up in his tent and stare at his hands and wonder if they were still his hands, if he was still him. If the thing wearing his face was Randall Thor or something else wearing Randall Thor like a suit, and Matt would appear, not summoned, not asked, just there, leaning against the tent pole, arms crossed, looking at Rand with an expression that wasn't pity, wasn't fear, was something older than both. Something that said, I've been waiting for you to need me, and I'm not going anywhere, so you might as well stop pretending you don't. And Rand would say, you should be asleep. And Matt would say, you should be asleep. And yet, here we are. And he'd sit down, not across from Rand, next to him, close, shoulder almost touching shoulder, the way they used to sit on the hill above Emond's field, watching the sun go down, not saying anything because nothing needed saying. And sometimes Rand would talk about the dreams, about the voice, about the feeling of being used, of being a tool, of being a weapon that the pattern picked up and swung and would put down when the war was over. And his voice would go thin, small, the voice of the boy underneath the god, and Matt would listen. And when Rand was done, Matt would say something like, you know what you are? You're not a weapon. You're not a prophecy. You're not the dragon. You're Randall Thor, and you owe me a drink from Beltane 2 years ago, and I intend to collect, and if you go all cosmic and impersonal on me before you pay up, I will find you in whatever dimension you've ascended to. and I will hold you upside down by the ankles until the coins fall out of your pocket." And Rand would laugh, the one that sounded like a boy who'd been holding his breath for too long and finally let it out. And that laugh was the whole point. That laugh was the mission. Because as long as Rand could laugh like that, really laugh with his whole chest, with his eyes crinkling, with the sound of it rough and unpolished and human, he was still in there. The shepherd was still in there. The boy who couldn't whistle was still in there, and Mat would keep him there, not with power, not with prophecy, with stubbornness, with profanity, with the simple, unshakable refusal to treat Randall Thor as anything other than a person. And here's the part that Mat never said, the part he wouldn't say, the part he buried under jokes and dice and the perpetual performance of not caring. He was terrified, not of the Dark One, not of the Shadow, not of the last battle. He was terrified of waking up one morning and looking at Rand and seeing no one behind the eyes. Of looking at the dragon reborn and finding that Rand, his Rand, the Rand who'd shared apples and chased sheep and gotten into fistfights over nothing at Beltane, was just gone, swallowed, digested by the pattern until there was nothing left but the function, the role, the weapon. And Mat couldn't fix that. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't out-general it. He couldn't roll dice at it. He couldn't cheat the pattern out of its champion. All he could do was be there, stand in the room, put his boots on the table, make the joke, pour the drink, say the name. Rand. 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 Not my Lord Dragon. Not Dragon Reborn. Not the Light's champion. Rand. Just Rand. The name his mother gave him. The name that meant he was a boy before he was a god. That was the anchor. That was the rope. That was the whole strategy. Not to save the world, not to win the war, just to keep saying the name until the boy answered. Maybe. It wasn't just for Rand, because Mat needed it too. Needed Rand to be there. Needed the shepherd to exist, because as long as Rand was still Rand, then Mat was still Mat. Still the one who stole apples and cheated at cards and ran from his mother's spoon. Still a person, not a general, not a weapon, not a piece on the pattern's board. If Rand disappeared into the dragon, then Mat would be alone in it. Alone in the war. Alone in the memories. Alone with 3,000 dead generals in his head, and no one who remembered him when he was small, when he was just a boy. When the biggest problem in his life was whether he could sneak a second slice of pie before his mother caught him. He needed Rand to remember that, for both of them. So he kept showing up, kept sitting down, kept putting his boots on the table and saying, "You look like hell, Rand, eat something." And Rand kept eating, and the boy stayed, because it was all Mat had, all he could give. Not power, not glory, not the grand sweeping gesture that bards write songs about. Just a boy, sitting next to another boy, in a tent, in the dark, saying, "I'm here, I'm not going anywhere, and you're not allowed to disappear on me. You hear me? You owe me that drink, and I collect my debts. Always." And Mat kept watch, because someone had to, and it was never going to be anyone but him. Let me tell you about the time Mat Cauthon got married. No, actually, let me tell you about the time Mat Cauthon was informed he was getting married, because there is a difference. A significant, fundamental, soul-crushing difference. It started, as all of Mat's worst experiences started, with a prophecy. Back in Rhuidean, in that terrible shimmering space behind the doorframe, the Aelfin had given him 3 answers, 3 truths he hadn't wanted to hear. And one of them, the one that made him want to crawl back through the doorframe and take his chances with the snake folk rather than face the daylight, was this: "You will marry the daughter of the 9 moons." And Mat, still half dead, still reeling from 3,000 years of warfare pouring into his skull, still tasting copper and void, had heard those words and thought, "Wonderful, brilliant, lovely. I'm going to marry a moon, or a daughter of a moon, or 9 moons, whatever that means. Probably means I'll die alone in a ditch, which, honestly, is the more likely outcome, so I'll just go with that." He forgot about it. Or tried to. Buried it under the more immediate concerns of not dying, not being eaten by shadow spawn, and finding a decent meal. The prophecy sat in the back of his mind like a splinter, present, but easy to ignore if you didn't think about it too hard. And then he met Tuon. It was Ebu'da, the city of knives and sea salt and women who carried daggers in their garters and used them with casual, terrifying proficiency. Matt was there because Rand was there, because the Aes Sedai were there, because the whole bloody world kept funneling him into places he didn't want to be, and Ebu'da was just the latest in a long, exhausting line of such places. And he saw her. Not in a ballroom, not at a grand feast, not in some sweeping cinematic moment where the music swells and the light catches her hair and the hero's heart stops in his chest. No. He saw her in a street, in the middle of a crowd, and she was looking at him. Not at him, exactly. Through him. The way you look at a chess piece, you're trying to decide whether to take or leave. She was small, dark-haired, dark-eyed. Beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, clean, precise, and faintly threatening. She wore authority the way other people wore clothes, naturally, inevitably, as if she'd been born in it, which, as it turned out, she had. Tuon Athem Kore Paendra, daughter of the Empress of Shonshan, the daughter of the 9 moons. And Matt looked at her. And the splinter in his mind, the prophecy, the one he'd been ignoring for months, flared, hot, bright, unmissable. And Matt thought, oh no. Oh, absolutely not. No. And he smiled, because he was Matt, because smiling was easier than screaming. And he said, very politely, very carefully, with the air of a man trying to defuse a bomb, "Good evening." And Tuon looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes and said nothing. And then she walked away, and Matt watched her go, and the dice in his head rolled and settled and went very, very quiet. And he thought, I'm doomed. I'm actually, genuinely, properly doomed. Now, here's the thing about what happened next. People tell the story differently depending on which side of the ocean they're standing on. The Shanchan version, the noble daughter of the 9 moons, was taken captive by a barbarian warlord, a kidnapping, an outrage, a stain on imperial honor. Matt's version, I did not kidnap her. I did not kidnap her. I was trying to get away from her. I was running. She was following. And at some point the geometry of the situation got confused and everyone decided I was in charge, which I was not. I want it noted for the record. I want it in writing. I want a signed document saying I did not kidnap anyone. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in the middle, and also much more complicated, and also much funnier than either side would admit. What happened was this. Matt, in the middle of a battle, in the middle of a city that was actively trying to kill him, encountered Tuon in a situation where leaving her meant she'd be killed by someone else, and taking her meant he'd be stuck with her. And he made the split-second, absolutely instinctive, thoroughly idiotic decision to take her. Because that's what he did. That's what he always did. He grabbed the thing he wasn't supposed to grab, and he ran, and he dealt with the consequences later. And Tuon let him. That's the part nobody talks about. She let him. She could have screamed. She could have fought. She could have summoned her guard, her damane, her entire imperial retinue. She didn't. She looked at this wild-eyed, filthy, bleeding man who was saying, "Come with me, come on, move, they're coming." And she looked at him with those calm, calculating eyes, and she made a decision. Fast. Faster than Matt could see, faster than Matt could understand. She went with him. And that was the beginning, not of a romance, not of a love story. Not yet. It was the beginning of 2 people being stuck in the same room and discovering, to their mutual horror, that the room was smaller than they thought and the walls were closing in, and they were going to have to figure out how to breathe in the same space without killing each other. And they hated it, both of them. Immediately. Viscerally. With the full creative energy of 2 people who are very, very used to being in control and who have just discovered that control is no longer available. Matt hated that she was noble. Hated the way she spoke, precise and cold and faintly condescending, as if every sentence were a small act of mercy bestowed upon a lesser creature. Hated the way she looked at the world and saw property. People as property, land as property, the sky as property. hated the casual, bone-deep assumption that she was above everyone, that the universe had sorted itself into a hierarchy and she was near the top, and everyone else was just, furniture. "You know what your problem is," he said to her 3 days into their unwanted partnership, while they were hiding in a farmhouse that smelled like turnips and old socks. "Your problem is, you think the world owes you something. You think because your mum wears a fancy hat, you get to walk into a room and everyone should bow. And they shouldn't. Nobody should bow. Bowing is stupid. I've never bowed in my life, and I don't intend to start." And Tuon looked at him, and she said very quietly, with the patience of a woman explaining gravity to a toddler, "You are speaking to the daughter of the 9 moons." And Matt said, "Yeah, and I'm the man who's got the only horse and the only map and the only idea where we're going, so unless the 9 moons are planning to walk, I suggest you shut up and eat your turnip." And she did not thank him, and he did not expect her to. And somehow, in that small, ugly, turnip-scented moment, something shifted. Just a hair, just a crack, because she ate the turnip, and he'd given her the turnip, and neither of them had killed the other. And that was, apparently, the foundation on which the rest of it would be built. And Tuon hated him too. Hated his informality, his sloppiness, his refusal to observe protocol, his dice, his jokes, his absolute, maddening inability to understand that the world had structure, that the structure existed for a reason, and that a man who ignored the structure was not a free spirit, but a child. She hated that he made her laugh, not often, not easily, but sometimes, in spite of herself, a corner of her mouth would twitch, and he'd see it, and he'd grin, and she'd want to hit him. She hated that he was kind to her servants, that he learned their names, that he asked them questions and listened to the answers, that he treated them like people instead of function. In the Shanshan Empire, you did not ask a servant their name. You did not ask them how they were feeling. You gave an order, and they obeyed. And Matt looked at that system and said, "That's rubbish," and then proceeded to ignore it with the cheerful, unbothered confidence of a man who has never once in his life done what he was told. And Tuon watched him do it. And she was furious, and she was fascinated, and she did not know which feeling was worse. And then, slowly, painfully, in the way that all real things happen, became something else. Not soft, never soft. Neither of them was built for soft, but real, a kind of real that you can't fake and can't perform and can't manufacture. The real of 2 people who have seen each other at their worst, filthy, exhausted, terrified, furious, and who have decided, by a series of small, grudging, unspoken choices, to keep seeing each other, to keep showing up, to keep passing the turnip. Matt started to notice things. That Tuon's coldness wasn't cruelty. It was armor. It was the only thing she had in a court full of people who wanted her dead. That her precision wasn't arrogance. It was survival. That the way she held herself, rigid, controlled, absolutely still, was the posture of a woman who had learned, young, that one wrong move meant a knife in the dark. And Tuon started to notice things. That Matt's chaos wasn't stupidity, it was freedom. It was the one thing she'd never been allowed to have. That his jokes weren't disrespect, they were invitations. Come here, be a person, put the mask down. Laugh at something stupid, be small, be safe, just for a minute. And one night, I won't say which night because it's theirs, not mine, he stopped calling her your bloody highness and called her Tuon. And she stopped calling him you there and called him Matt. And neither of them made a speech about it. Neither of them announced it. They just did it. And the world kept turning. And the dice kept rolling. And the splinter in his mind went quiet. And then there was the title. Because of course there was a title. Because Matt Cauthon, the boy who hated nobility, who hated bowing, who hated every single thing about courts and thrones and the suffocating machinery of inherited power, became the Prince of the Ravens. The Prince of the 9 Moons. A prince of the Shanshan Empire. He had to wear silk. He had to attend ceremonies. He had to stand in rooms full of people who wanted to stab him and smile and pretend he wasn't counting the exits. He had to learn the forms of address. The 17 different ways to greet a noble, depending on their rank, their province, their bloodline, and whether it was raining. "I hate this," he said, every single morning while someone was lacing him into clothes that cost more than his father's farm. "I hate this. I hate this. I want to go home. I want my old coat. I want my dice. I want to sit in a tavern and not know anyone's name and not have anyone know mine." And then he'd walk into the throne room and he'd stand next to Tuon and he'd do the thing because she needed him to do the thing. Because the Empire needed the thing done. Because if he didn't do the thing, people would die. And he made a decision a long time ago in a farmhouse that smelled like turnips that he wasn't going to let people die if he could stop it. So he did the thing. In silk, with a crown he didn't want. In a country that wasn't his. Beside a woman who still looked at him like she was deciding whether to keep him or discard him. And he did it well. And he hated every second of it. And he wouldn't have traded it, not for all the dice in the world. Because somewhere between the first turnip and the silk, between the kidnapping and the title, between the hatred and the grudging respect and the slow, terrifying, irreversible slide into something neither of them had a name for, somewhere in there Matt Cauthon found the one thing he hadn't known he was looking for, someone who saw him. Not the general, not the gambler, not the trickster, not the boy with the dead men in his head. Just him. Just Matt. Just the boy who stole pies and ran from his mother and wanted to be left alone. She saw him, and she didn't look away. And that was enough. That was everything. There are people in your life who change the shape of you, not loudly, not with speeches or grand gestures, just by being there, just by looking at you, really looking, and seeing something you didn't know was there. And once they've seen it, you can't unbe seen. You can't go back to being the thing you were before, because now you know what you could be. And that knowledge is a kind of weight, a good weight, but a weight. Moiraine Sedai was that for Matt Cauthon. She wasn't his mother, she wasn't his lover. She wasn't his friend exactly, not in the way he understood friendship, which was dice and ale and someone willing to be an idiot alongside you. She was something else. Something harder to name. She was the first person who looked at him and didn't see a problem to be solved. Everyone else saw a problem. The Two Rivers saw a boy who needed to settle down and do honest work. The Aes Sedai saw a tavern to be managed. Ran saw a friend he was worried about. The Pattern saw a piece to be placed. Moiraine saw a person. A specific, stubborn, brilliant, infuriating person. And she said, very early, before the dagger, before the White Tower, before any of it, "You are more than you know, Matt Cauthon, and one day you will be glad of it." And Matt had said, "Yeah, well, I'd rather be glad of a hot meal and a soft bed, if it's all the same to you." But he remembered the way she said it, the certainty in it, the quiet, unshakable faith that he was not just a boy stealing apples, that he was something, that he mattered. Not as a general, not as a weapon, as him, as Matt. The boy with the dice and the grin and the absolute refusal to be anyone's soldier. She saw that, and she didn't try to change it. She just acknowledged it, and moved on, and let him be. And that was the first gift anyone had ever given him. The gift of being seen, and not being fixed. And then she was gone. Not dead. Worse than dead in some ways. Taken, pulled into a place that wasn't a place. A space between spaces. The Tower of Ghenjei. That impossible structure. That wrong shape on the horizon. That thing that looked like a finger made of dark glass pointing at a sky that didn't quite exist. The home of the Aelfin and the Eelfin. The snake folk and the fox folk. The same creatures who'd given him the spear, the medallion, the memories. The same creatures who put the scar on his neck and the generals in his head. Moiraine was in there, trapped, held. Used as a battery, maybe. A source. A thing to be drained of power and purpose until there was nothing left but the shape of her. And Matt found out. And Matt stood very still for a long time. And the dice in his head rolled and rolled and rolled, and he let them roll. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't try to argue. He just listened. And what they said was, "You owe her, not the pattern, not the wheel. Not destiny." He owed her, because she'd seen him, because she'd been kind in a world that wasn't kind, because she'd walked into the 2 rivers and saved 3 boys from Trollocs and asked for nothing, because she'd healed him when the dagger was eating him alive and hadn't charged him a coin or held it over his head, because she was Moiraine, and Moiraine was in the dark, and no one was coming for her. No one except him. Right, he said, to no one, to the air, to the dice, right, fine, I'll go get her. And I want it noted. I want it W-R-I written down, in ink, in a book, on a shelf somewhere, that I am doing this voluntarily. No one is making me. The pattern is not making me. I am choosing this. The man who was going to find a tavern. The man who was going to retire. The man who was going to sit down and never get up again. That man is walking into the Tower of Ghenjei. And he is going to be very cross about it the entire time. And he went. The Tower of Ghenjei was not a building. That's the first thing you need to understand. It wasn't made of stone or wood or metal. It was made of wrongness. The walls were the color of a bruise. The floor tilted in directions that didn't exist. The air tasted like copper and old flowers and something else, something sweet and rotting, like fruit left too long in the sun. And the sound. Gods, the sound. Not silence. Never silence. Thousands of voices, layered, overlapping, saying things just below the threshold of comprehension. Not words. Not quite. Almost words. The shape of words without the substance. Like hearing someone speak in the next room through a thick wall. You know they're talking. You can almost make it out, but you can't. And the not quite knowing is worse than silence. Worse than screaming. And the Aelfin were there. The Eelfin were there, the snake folk and the fox folk, moving in the corners, in the shadows, in the spaces between one breath and the next, watching, waiting, smiling with mouths that had too many teeth. And Matt walked through it, with the spear in his hand, with the fox medallion at his chest, with the dice screaming in his skull. And he walked like he belonged there. Like he had every right to be there. Because he did. Because they'd made him. Because they'd put their memories in his head, and their scar on his neck, and their spear in his hand, and that made him theirs, in a way. And he was going to use that. Right, he said to the dark, to the whispering, to the things with too many teeth. I'm here for Moiraine, and I know how this works. I know you don't give things away. I know there's a price, so let's hear it. Let's get this over with. What do you want? And the dark answered, not in words, in a feeling, in a pressure behind his eyes, in a cold, precise surgical pointing at his face, at his left eye. This, the dark said, this is the price. Not your life, not your soul, not your memories, just this, one eye, one half of your sight, one piece of the way you see the world. Give it to us and she goes free. Keep it and she stays. And you walk out, and you forget, and you go find your tavern, and no one ever knows. And Matt stood there, with the whispering in his ears, and the dice going silent in his head. Silent, for the first time in years, silent like the world was holding its breath, and he thought, one eye. Just one. Just the left one. He could still see. He could still fight. He could still roll dice, probably, though the depth perception would be a nightmare. He could still walk, still breathe, still eat, still complain. Still be Matt Cauthon, the luckiest, most unfortunate man alive. But he'd see the world differently, forever. Half of it gone, half of the light, half of the color, a permanent shadow on one side of everything, a reminder, a brand. You gave something, you chose to give something, and you can't take it back. And he thought about the tavern, the hot meal, the long golden afternoon of not being anyone's responsibility. And he thought about Moiraine in the dark, being drained, being used, being nothing because no one came, because no one cared enough to pay. And he thought about what she'd said all those years ago in a village so small it didn't have a name worth remembering. You are more than you know, Matt Cauthon. And he said, take it. Not loudly, not heroically, not with a speech. Just 2 words, flat and final, the way you say, take it, when you're handing over a coin for a drink you didn't want but needed. and the dark moved, and the pain. Because Matt wouldn't, he'd skip it, he'd wave his hand and say, yeah, it hurt a lot, let's move on. But I'm going to tell you this much, it hurt. Not like a cut. Not like a burn. Like something reaching into his skull and pulling. Not the eye itself. They didn't gouge it out, didn't carve it from the socket. They took the seeing from it. They reached into the nerve, into the connection, into the tiny electrical thread that ran from his eye to his brain, and they severed it. And the severing was not clean. It was ragged. It was a sound like tearing cloth, except the cloth was him. And he screamed. Not bravely, not silently. He screamed like a boy, like the boy he was, underneath the generals and the memories and the scars and the spear. The boy who'd cried when a lamb got caught in the fence. The boy who'd run from his mother's spoon. The boy who'd looked at a ruby dagger and thought, that's worth a lot of coin, and hadn't known what it would cost. He screamed. And the dark took what it wanted. And it was done. And Matt Cauthon stood in the tower of Ghenjei with one eye, and the world tilted, and the light halved, and there was a shadow on the left side of everything that would never go away. Never. Not in a year, not in 10, not ever. And he said, breathing hard, bleeding, shaking, I suppose I didn't need both anyway. Depth perception is overrated, and I'll save a fortune on spectacles. And the dark almost smiled. Almost. Almost. And Moraine was there, behind him, breathing, alive, confused, thin, diminished, but there, but alive. And she looked at him, at this one-eyed, bleeding, grinning idiot with a black spear and a fox medallion and 3,000 years of dead generals in his head, and she said, Matt, just his name. But the way she said it, the weight in it, the surprise, as if she hadn't believed anyone would come, as if she'd made her peace with the dark, as if she'd decided, in the long, slow hours of being nothing, that no one was worth saving her, that no one would pay. And Matt said, yeah, me, obviously me, because apparently I'm the one who does the stupid things. I'm the one who walks into the dark and pays the price and walks out the other side looking like hell. That's my job. That's my whole bloody job. Can we go now? I want to sit down. I want to close my remaining eye. I want to not be in this place anymore. And they walked out. Together. And the Tower of Ghenjei let them go. And the wrong-colored walls faded. And the whispering stopped. And the sky above them was the right color. Blue. Ordinary. Beautiful in its ordinariness. And Matt looked at it with one eye. And it was enough. It was enough. And here's the thing that matters. The thing that separates this moment from every other moment in Matt Cauthon's miserable, glorious, improbable life. He chose it, not the pattern, not the wheel, not the generals in his head, not the prophecy, not the dice. Him, Matt, the boy from Emond's field, the one who stole apples, the one who ran from responsibility, the one who said, no thank you, to the wheel of time. He walked into that tower, and he paid the price, and he did it because he decided to. Not because the pattern needed Moraine, not because the war required it, not because anyone asked him to, because she'd been kind, because she'd seen him, because someone, somewhere, had looked at Matt Cauthon and said, you matter. And he was going to spend the rest of his life making sure that someone, that person, got to keep breathing. That's who he was, under the jokes, under the dice, under the running and the complaining and the perpetual performance of not caring. That's who he was. A boy who would give you his eye and then make a joke about the price of spectacles and walk away and not look back and not tell anyone and not want thanks and not want praise and not want anything except to sit down, close his one remaining eye and pretend that the shadow on the left side of the world had always been there. It hadn't. But he'd carry it. He'd carry it, and he'd grin, and the dice would roll, and the world would keep turning, and Matt Cauthon would keep walking. One-eyed, half-blind, whole. More whole than he'd ever been. Because for the first time in his life, the choice was his, and he'd made it. And it had cost him everything he thought he'd need, and he was still standing, and the person he'd saved was breathing, and the tavern could wait. The tavern could always wait. There is a moment in every war, A moment that the histories will remember and the songs will stretch and the bards will embellish until the truth is buried under so much ornament that no one can find it anymore. And that moment is the moment when the person in command looks at the field and realizes that everything they have planned is about to fall apart, and they must decide, in the space of a single breath, whether they are going to let it fall, or whether they are going to hold it together with their bare hands and the stubborn, irrational, absolutely human refusal to accept that this is where it ends. For Mat Cauthon, that moment came on the plains of Merilor, on the last day the world would ever see, when the sky itself was the wrong color and the ground shook with the march of 1,000,000 feet and the air tasted like iron and ash and the end of all things, the last battle. The confrontation that every prophecy in every nation had pointed toward like a compass needle pointing north, inevitable and indifferent and absolute. And at the center of it, not a god, not a channeler, not a man wreathed in Sedin or Shadar or the light of the Creator's own hand, but a one-eyed boy from a village so small it didn't appear on most maps, standing on a hill with a black spear in his hand, and 3,000 years of dead generals whispering in his skull, trying to figure out how to keep 2 million people alive for one more hour. Rand had gone. That was the first thing, the thing that made everything else possible and everything else terrifying in equal measure. Because Rand Althor, the dragon reborn, the man who could channel enough of the one power to crack the world like an egg, had walked toward the pit of doom to face the Dark One himself, and he had looked at Mat before he went, and he had said, very quietly, with that distant, exhausted voice that had become his, "Default over the last months of the war. The ground is yours, Mat. All of it. Every army, every banner, every soul standing between the shadow and the light. It's yours, and I need you to not let them die." And Mat had looked back at him, at this man who had been his best friend since they were children chasing sheep through the hills above Emond's field, and he had wanted to say something clever, something deflecting, something that would make them both laugh and take the weight off for just one more second, but the words wouldn't come, because the weight was already there, settling onto his shoulders like a physical thing, like a yoke, like the iron collar of command that every general in his head had worn and hated and never managed to take off. And all he said was, "Go. Go do your thing. I'll keep the floor tidy. And Rand, come back. You still owe me that drink." And Rand smiled, that rare, real, unguarded smile that Mat had spent years trying to protect. And then he turned, and he walked into the dark, and the ground shook, and the sky split, and the last battle began. The field at Merilor stretched in every direction like a wound in the earth, a vast, flat, grey-green expanse where the armies of every nation that still existed had gathered under banners that had nothing in common, except the desperate, stubborn hope that tomorrow might still be a thing that happened. And Mat stood at the crest of the only rise for 3 miles in any direction, and he looked at them, and he looked at what was coming toward them, and the generals in his head went very, very quiet, the way they always went quiet before the moment when the plan had to be made and the lives had to be spent and the arithmetic of death had to be calculated and accepted and acted upon. On one side, the forces of the light, Aiel and Borderlanders and Andorans and Shanchan and men and women from a dozen nations who had spent centuries killing each other and who were now standing shoulder to shoulder. Because the alternative was extinction, and they were frightened, and they were exhausted, and they were looking up at the hill where Mat stood, waiting for him to tell them where to go, when to move, how to die, and whether their dying would mean something, or whether it would just be mud and blood and a name no one would remember. On the other side, the shadow. Trollocs in numbers that made the mind stutter. Murdral moving through them like knives through water. And at their head, riding a horse the color of a bruise, wearing armor that seemed to drink the light around it, carrying a sa'angreal that pulsed with enough of the one power to level mountains, was Demandred, the most powerful of the Forsaken, the man who had wanted to be the dragon, and had been denied, and who had carried that denial like a wound for 3,000 years, and who had come to this field not just to win, but to erase, to unmake, to prove that the pattern had chosen wrong, and that he, Demandred, should have been the one standing at the center of everything. And Matt looked at Demandred, and Demandred looked at Matt, and the distance between them was 3 miles of open ground and 2 million soldiers, and the entire weight of the world's remaining hope. And Matt thought, with the calm, exhausted clarity of a man who has been running for so long that he has finally stopped and turned around. Right. So, he's got the power of a god. I've got a stick and a bad eye and a headache. Let's see if 3,000 years of other people's cleverness is enough to make up the difference. The battle did not go the way the Psalms would later say it went, because the Psalms would compress it, would flatten it, would turn 6 hours of grinding, screaming, contradictory, chaotic slaughter into a clean narrative with a beginning and a middle and a triumphant end. And that would be a lie, because the truth was that for the first 3 hours, Matt was losing. And he knew he was losing. And every order he gave was a triage decision, a choice about which wound to press his hand against and which to let bleed, because he did not have enough men to hold every line, and he did not have enough time to reinforce the ones that mattered. And Demandred was patient and smart and absolutely relentless, probing every weak point, pressing every seam, waiting for the moment when the whole structure would buckle. And it was buckling. Matt could feel it in the reports that came running up the hill, breathless and blood-spattered, telling him that the eastern flank had collapsed, that the Aiel were being pushed back, that the Shan cavalry had been cut off from their infantry, that a Myrddraal-led assault had punched through the center and was widening the gap with every passing minute. And Matt listened to all of it, and he did not panic, because panic was a luxury he could not afford. And because the generals in his head were not panicking either, they were calculating, adjusting, feeding him options the way a card sharp feeds information to a player at the table, and he took those options. And he weighed them and he chose, and the choosing was agony because every choice meant someone lived and someone else did not, and he had to live with both halves of that equation, now and forever, until the end of his days. He shifted the Borderlanders east to plug the collapse, knowing it would expose the western ridge, and he sent the Red Hand, his Red Hand, the men who had followed him from nothing, the men who ate from the same pot and cursed at the same weather and played dice with him in the mud. He sent them west to hold the ridge, knowing that some of them would not come back, knowing that he was spending the people he loved because they were the ones he trusted most. And that knowledge sat in his chest like a blade, cold and sharp and immovable, and he could not remove it, could not set it aside, could not pretend it wasn't there. He could only keep giving orders and hope that the arithmetic held, that the geometry of the field favored him, that 3,000 years of accumulated cunning could outthink one man with the power of a god. And then Demandred moved. Not the armies, not the Trollocs, himself. He rode forward, alone, into the space between the lines, and he raised the Sa'angreal, and the sky above him opened, and fire came down, not natural fire, not any fire that had ever warmed a hearth or lit a forge, but white, annihilating fire that erased everything it touched, and where it fell, men did not die. They simply ceased. They were there, and then they were not, and the sound they made was not a scream, it was a silence. Whole in the noise of the battle where a person had been and now wasn't, and Matt watched it happen, watched 100 men vanish in a single pulse of that terrible light, and something in his chest cracked. Courage, not his resolve, but his patience, his ability to keep calculating, to keep treating the battlefield as an abstraction, because those were people, those were men with names and families and bad jokes and favorite songs, and they were gone, and the man who had erased them was riding forward, looking for Matt, looking for the one man on the field who was not a god, not a channeler, not a creature of the power, just a man, with a spear and a scar and a headache and a stubborn, irrational, absolutely human refusal to die. And Matt rode down to meet him, not because he could win, not because he had a plan, not because the generals in his head had handed him a solution, because they hadn't. They were silent, all of them, for the first time since Rhuidean, silent because this was not a problem of tactics or terrain or timing. This was a problem of one mortal body against an immortal will, and no amount of cleverness changes that equation. He rode down because if he didn't, no one would. Because every other option involved more of those silences, more of those holes where people used to be. And because Matt Cauthon had made a decision a long time ago in a farmhouse that smelled like turnips, that he would not let people die if he could stand between them and the thing that wanted them dead. And this was that thing, and he was standing, and that was enough. That had to be. Enough, because it was all he had. The fight itself lasted less than a minute. Demandred was faster, stronger, armed with the power itself, and Matt was one man with a spear and a bad eye and a body that ached in every joint, and the first blow caught him across the ribs and he felt something crack. And the second caught him on the shoulder and he felt the joint shift, and the third should have killed him, should have taken his head from his shoulders, but he wasn't there when it arrived because his body moved the way it always moved, sideways, wrong, against every rule of engagement, the way a street brawler moves, the way a boy moves when he's been dodging his mother's spoon for 14 years and has learned that the only way to survive a blow you can't block is to not be where the blow expects you to be, and the spear in his hand found the gap, the one gap, the gap that 3,000 years of watching warriors fight had burned into his muscle memory. The gap between Demandred's guard and his arrogance, between his power and his certainty, between the god he thought he was and the man he still was underneath, and the Ashandari went in, and Demandred looked down at the shaft in his chest, and his face was not angry, it was surprised, genuinely, childishly surprised, as if he could not believe that this was how it ended, that this one-eyed, bleeding, improbable little man had found the one angle, the one moment, the one crack in the armor of a god, and he said, "This is not, this cannot," and then he fell, and the Angreal went dark, and the sky closed, and the fire stopped, and the battle, which had been a scream, became a whisper, and then became silence. And Matt stood in the silence, on a field of the dead, with blood on his hands and his ribs and his face, with one eye and a broken shoulder and a body that felt like it had been fed through a millstone. And he looked at the sky, which was the right color again, blue, ordinary, achingly, unbearably ordinary, and the dice in his head rolled one last time, soft and slow, like a lullaby, like a hand smoothing the hair back from a fevered forehead, and they settled. And they were quiet, and for the first time since Shadar Logoth, since the ruby dagger, since the doorframe, since all of it, Matt Cauthon stood in a moment that was not moving, not pulling, not demanding, not asking him to run or fight or decide or sacrifice, and he breathed, and the breath was his, and the silence was his, and the field was his, and the dead were his, and the living were his, and he had done it. Not as a god, not as a prophecy, not as the pattern's instrument, but as a man, just a man, mortal and flawed and one-eyed and exhausted and still, somehow, impossibly, standing. Well, he said to no one, to the field, to the dead, to the dice, to the 3,000 generals who were finally, blessedly silent in his head. That's that then. Someone find me a chair, and possibly a medic, in that order. The chair first, the drink second, the medic can wait. I've been waiting my whole life for a chair. And then the whole army, 2 million strong, bleeding and broken and alive, laughed, because their general was sitting down in the mud and asking for a chair. And that was so perfectly, so absolutely, so irrevocably Matt Cauthon that it broke something open in all of them, and they laughed, and they cried, and they held each other, and the sun came out, and the wheel turned, and the world kept going. Because a man had stood, mortal flesh, immortal will, and it had been enough, it had always been enough. The world did not end on the plains of Merilor. And in the days that followed, as the smoke cleared and the dead were counted, and the living stood blinking in the unfamiliar silence of a war that was actually, genuinely, irrevocably over, the question that everyone began to ask, in taverns and throne rooms and war tents and the quiet spaces between one breath and the next, was the same question, phrased 100 different ways but meaning the same thing in every language. What happens to Matt Cauthon now? Because he was, by any measure that mattered, the most important man alive. He had commanded the armies of every nation on the face of the earth. He had stood on the field and held the line when the line should have broken. He had killed Demandred with a spear and a prayer and a stubborn refusal to be where the blow expected him to be. He was the Prince of the Ravens, the consort of the Daughter of the Nine Moons, the general of the Band of the Red Hand, the man who had looked at the shadow and told it to sit down and wait its turn. He was, in the eyes of every king and queen and emperor and lord who had survived the last battle, the natural choice for whatever came next, whatever shape the new world was going to take, because when you have a man who can hold 2 million soldiers together with nothing but his voice and his will and his absolute refusal to let them die, you do not let that man walk away. You give him a throne. You give him a title. You give him a seat at the head of every table where the future is being carved up and distributed and argued over. You keep him. You need him. You cannot let him go. And Mat Cauthon, bleeding and broken and exhausted beyond any word that any language has ever devised for exhaustion, looked at all of them, at the kings and the queens and the generals and the Aes Sedai and the lords, and the ladies and the scribes already sharpening their quills to write his name into the histories, and he thought, with the quiet, bone-deep certainty of a man who has been carrying a weight for so long that he has forgotten what it feels like to stand upright without it. No, absolutely not. Not a chance. Not for all the thrones in all the nations in all the world. I am going to find a horse, and I am going to ride until the horses give out, and then I am going to walk until my legs give out, and then I am going to sit down in a ditch, and I am going to stay in that ditch until someone brings me a pie. And if that takes 3 weeks, then I will sit in that ditch for 3 weeks, and I do not care if the entire pattern comes down and tells me I have a responsibility, because I have done my responsibility, and I have done it with one eye and a bad shoulder and a headache that has lasted approximately 4 years, and I am done. They tried, of course. They always tried. The Aes Sedai came first, with their careful words and their gentle suggestions and their absolute certainty that Mat Cauthon owed the world one more decade of service, that his unique combination of luck and tactical genius made him irreplaceable, that the new order would need a military commander of his caliber, and Mat listened to them with his remaining eye half closed and his arms crossed and his expression fixed in that particular look that Tuon had once described as the face of a man who is physically present but spiritually in another country. And when they finished, he said, "Thank you very much for the offer. It sounds lovely. Truly. I hope it goes well for whoever you get to do it. I will not be that person. I will be somewhere else. Possibly asleep. Definitely somewhere else." And the merchants who wanted trade routes secured, and the generals who wanted to serve under him, and the soldiers, his soldiers, the Red Hand, who stood in formation outside his tent and waited, because they would follow him anywhere. They had followed him from nothing. They had followed him through mud and blood, and the long grey marches of a war that should have killed them all. And if he said the word, they would follow him into whatever came next, whether it was peace or politics or the quiet administration of a world that, no longer needed saving. And Mat looked at them through the flap of his tent, and his chest ached, and the dice rolled softly in his skull, and he thought, "Gods, I love them. I love every single one of them. And I cannot stay. Because if I stay, I become the thing they need me to be, and the thing they need me to be is not me. It's a general. It's a prince. It's a name on a banner. And I am not a name on a banner. I am Mat. I am the boy who steals pies. And the boy who steals pies cannot sit at a council table and argue about grain tariffs and trade agreements and the proper protocol for addressing a visiting dignitary. One found him that evening, sitting on the crest of a hill above the camp, watching the sun go down with his one good eye and his one bad eye, watching it with both, because even the dark half of his vision had its own kind of beauty, its own kind of truth, a reminder of what he'd given and what it had cost and what it had bought. And he was not looking at the sunset the way a poet looks at a sunset. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something he hasn't seen properly in years, drinking it in, letting it fill the spaces that the war had hollowed out, letting the orange and the gold and the long, slow purple of the fading light wash over him and through him and into the places that had been cold and tight and clenched for so long that he had forgotten they could be anything else. And Tuon sat down beside him, not behind him, not across from him, beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the evening air. And she did not speak for a while. She did not need to. They had reached, somewhere in the long, strange journey from Ibudar to Merilor, from kidnapping to marriage, from hatred to that grudging, fierce, unbreakable thing that neither of them had a name for, but both of them. Recognized, they had reached a place where silence was not empty but full, where not speaking was its own kind of conversation, where the absence of words meant I am here, I see you, I am not going anywhere, and you do not have to perform for me. You do not have to be the general or the prince or the trickster. You can just be the man sitting on the hill watching the sun go down, and that is enough. That is everything. And then she said quietly in that precise, measured voice that could cut glass or caress it depending on the hour and the mood and the particular angle of the light, "You are going to leave." It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was an observation delivered with the same calm certainty she applied to everything, the same clear-eyed assessment that she brought to battlefields and throne rooms, and the slow, patient work of building an empire. Matt turned to look at her, and he opened his mouth to deny it, to make a joke, to deflect, because that was what he did. That was the mechanism, the reflex, the shield. But the words died in his throat because she was looking at him with those dark, steady eyes, and there was no judgment in them, no anger, no hurt, only understanding, only the quiet, unshakable knowledge of a woman who had been trapped in a cage her entire life, and who recognized in another person the particular, desperate, bone-deep need to find a door. "I have to," he said, and the words came out smaller than he intended, smaller and rougher, stripped of the joke, stripped of the deflection, just the truth, naked and awkward and terrifying. "I have to go somewhere where no one knows my name, where no one needs me to be anything, where the biggest decision I have to make is whether to have ale or cider, and whether the dice are going to roll my way tonight, and whether the pie is any good, and I need that, Tuon. I need that the way I needed air in the Tower of Ghenjei. I need to be no one. I need to be small. I need to sit in a room where I am not the general, not the prince, not the man who killed Demandred, not the man who saved the world. I need to be the man in the corner with the dice, and no one looks at me, and no one expects anything, and I am just there, just a person, just Matt." And Tuon was quiet for a long time, and the sun went down, and the stars came out, and the camp below them settled into the murmur of 10,000 people preparing for sleep, and the sound of it was like the sound of the world breathing, slow and deep and alive. And finally she said, "I will not stop you. I will not ask you to stay because I know what it is to be owned by a role, and I will not do that to you, and I will not do it to myself by asking you to be something you are not." And Matt looked at her, and his chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with his broken ribs, and he said, "Come with me." And she looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, the mask slipped, and he saw it, the surprise, the tenderness, the terrified, fragile, absolutely human hope of a woman who had been raised to rule and to serve and to be a function, before she was a person, and who had been offered, by a one-eyed, bleeding, impossible man, the chance to be a person first. And she said, "You are asking the daughter of the 9 moons to run away and live in a village and eat pie." And Matt said, "Yes, and I'm asking her to bring the dice, because I will need an opponent, and you are the only person alive who can beat me at the table, and I need to lose sometimes. I need to lose regularly. I need to sit across from someone who looks at me and says, 'You are an idiot,' and means it, and I need that person to be you, and I need it to be every night, for the rest of whatever this is, and I am not asking you to be the daughter of the 9 moons, I am asking you to be Tuon. And I am asking you to let me be Matt, and I am asking if that is enough." And she was quiet, and the stars turned, and the dice in his head rolled, soft and slow, like a lullaby, like a blessing, like a hand on a shoulder saying, "Yes, yes, yes, this is the thing, this is the answer, this is the number the dice have been rolling toward all along." And she said, "You will need a bigger horse." And Matt laughed. And it was the real laugh, the full one. The one that came from the chest and the belly and the place underneath both where the boy still lived, the boy who stole apples and ran from his mother's spoon and wanted nothing more than to be left alone. He went to Rand the next morning, Not to say goodbye, because goodbye was too final, too heavy, too much like the kind of word that belongs in songs and histories and the mouths of people who are not friends but characters, and Matt Cauthon refused to be. A character, refused to be a figure in a narrative, refused to be the loyal companion in the story of the dragon reborn. He went to Rand because Rand was sitting in a tent with a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at nothing, carrying the weight of the world in a way that even victory had not lifted, and Matt walked in and sat down across from him and put his boots up on the table, because some things are sacred, some things are permanent, some things do not change even when the world ends and starts again, and boots on the war table was one of those things. And Rand looked at him, and Matt looked at Rand, and the silence between them was full of everything they would never say, every conversation they had missed, every night they should have talked and didn't, every moment when one of them had needed the other and the other had been too far away or too busy or too broken, and all of it was there, in the silence, and neither of them needed to put words to it, because words would have made it smaller, would have made it a thing that could be contained and filed away, and it was too big for that. Too old, too tangled, too much a part of the architecture of who they were. And Matt said, "I'm going. Not far. Not forever. But I'm going. And I need you to know that you don't owe me anything. You never did. I didn't do it for you. I didn't do it for the pattern. I didn't do it because I'm a hero or because I'm brave or because the dice told me to. I did it because you were there. Because you were my friend before you were the dragon. Because you were the boy who couldn't whistle, and I wasn't going to let you face the dark alone. And now you don't have to face it alone because it's gone, and you can rest, Rand. You can actually rest. You can be a person. You can be a shepherd. You can sit on a hill and watch the sheep and not think about the Dark One, and I need you to do that. I need you to do that for both of us, because I spent 4 years keeping you human, and now it's your turn to keep yourself human. And I can't do it anymore, because I'm going to sit in a tavern and lose a dice to my wife, and that is going to be the whole of my existence, and I need you to let that be enough." Him for a long time, and then he smiled, and it was the real smile, the shepherd's smile, the one from before. And he said, "You still owe me a drink, Matt." And Matt said, "No, you owe me Beltane 2 years ago. You said next round is on you, and then you got ascended or whatever it's called, and you never paid up. I intend to collect. I will ride back here in 10 years, or 20, or 50, and I will walk into whatever room you are sitting in, and I will say, 'You owe me a drink,' and you will buy me the drink, and we will sit, and we will not talk about the world, and we will not talk about the pattern, and we will talk about nothing, and it will be good." And Rand said, "It will be good." And Matt stood up. And he did not shake hands. He did not embrace. He did not do any of the things that heroes do in the stories when they part at the end of the journey. He just nodded, once. And Rand nodded back. And Matt walked out of the tent, and the sun was up, and the air was cold and clean and tasted like the first morning of the world, and he did not look back, because looking back would have made it harder. And it was hard. Enough already, and he wanted to remember Rand smiling, not Rand watching him go, because the watching was the part that would stay, the part that would ache in the quiet hours, and he wanted to carry the smile instead. And then he was gone, not with a ceremony, not with a speech, not with the Red Hand lined up to salute him, though they wanted to, though they stood at attention and waited and watched the road and hoped, but he slipped out the back of the camp, the way he'd slipped out of every place he'd ever been. The way he'd slipped out of Emond's field, out of the White Tower, out of Camelin, out of every city and every war and every destiny that had tried to hold him. He slipped out with Tuon beside him and 2 horses and a bag of dice and a spear strapped to his back that he would never use again but could not bring himself to leave behind, because it was part of him now, part of the architecture, part of the man he had been forced to become. And you do not leave parts of yourself behind, even the parts that ache, even the parts that remind you of what you paid and what it cost. West, away from the banners and the histories and the songs that were already being written, the songs that would get it wrong, that would make him noble, that would make him willing, that would make him a hero in the way that heroes are supposed to be, with a swelling orchestra and a noble sacrifice and a meaningful death. And none of it would be true, because the truth was that he was a boy who wanted a pie, and he got the pie, and he ate the pie, and he left, and the world went on without him. And that was fine. That was better than fine. That was the whole point. That was the thing he had fought for. Not the glory, not the gratitude, not the seat at the head of the table, but the right to walk away, the right to be small, the right to sit in a room where no one knew his name and roll the dice and lose and laugh and eat another slice of pie and not be responsible for a single living soul except himself and the woman sitting across from him who was cheating at the table and would deny it to her grave. No one gave him a monument. No one carved his name in stone. No one wrote his deeds in gold letters in the histories of the New World. And that was right. That was exactly, perfectly, beautifully right. Because Matt Cauthon did not want to be remembered. He did not want to be a legend. He did not want children to grow up hearing stories about the one-eyed general who saved the world. He wanted them to grow up hearing stories about their own mothers and fathers, their own villages, their own small, ordinary, glorious lives, and he wanted to be none of it. He wanted to be the man in the corner, the man with the dice, the man who smiled and said, "Your roll," and meant it, and meant nothing else, and meant the whole world in those two words. And the dice rolled, and the road stretched, and the sun was warm, and Tuon was beside him. And the pattern turned and turned and turned and carried him with it, gently, the way a river carries a leaf, not forcing, not demanding, just moving, just going, just being. And Matt Cauthon, who had said no to the wheel of time, who had said no to the pattern, who had said no to destiny and prophecy and the whole vast, indifferent machinery of fate, walked away from the end of the world with a woman at his side and dice in his pocket and pie in his future, and he did not look back and he did not stop, and he was, for the first time in his life, exactly where he wanted to be. Nowhere. Just nowhere. Just free. So, I told you the story. All of it. The dagger and the door frame and the dead generals and the one-eyed walk into the dark and the spear and the silk and the turnip and the woman who looked at him like he was a chess piece. And then, slowly, I told you about the boy who stole apples and the man who commanded 2 million souls and the one who walked away from both, because neither of them was who he was, not really, not underneath, not in the place where the dice live and the grin lives and the stubborn, ridiculous, unkillable need to be small and free and no one's weapon. And now I want to tell you what he was, not what he did. Not what the pattern made him do, or what the war required, or what the prophecies demanded. What he was, in the oldest sense. In the sense that goes back further than the two rivers, further than the breaking, further than the wheel itself. He was the trickster, not the hero, not the chosen one. Not the knight who rides into the dark with a shining sword and a prayer on his lips and the certainty of the righteous in his heart. He was the one who slipped in through the back door. The one who palmed the ace. The one who looked at the locked gate and said, "I'm not going over it, I'm not going through it, I'm going around it, and if there's no way around it, I'm going to convince the gate that it was never locked in the first place." He was Loki at the feast of the gods, making them laugh so they'd forget he'd stolen the mead. He was Hermes, stealing Apollo's cattle and then looking the sun god in the eye and saying, "What cattle?" He was the fox in every story ever told, the one who is smaller than the wolf and weaker than the bear, but who is still here, still alive, still grinning when the wolf and the bear have eaten each other and forgotten to look behind them. That was Matt. That was always Matt. Not the strongest, not the most powerful, not the most noble, the most alive, the most stubbornly, infuriatingly, beautifully alive. The one who cheated death, not with a sword but with a joke, not with prophecy but with a sideways step, not with the power but with a black-handled spear and a bad eye and the absolute refusal to be where the blow expected him to be. And that is why he matters. Not because he saved the world, though he did. Not because he commanded armies, though he did. Not because he married a princess, or killed a god, or walked into the tower of Ghenjei and walked out again with one less eye and one more reason to never trust a fox-shaped medallion. He matters because in a story full of gods and prophecies and the vast, grinding, indifferent machinery of fate, he was a person. Just a person. A person who was scared. A person who wanted to go home. A person who looked at the end of everything and said, well, I suppose someone has to do it, and it might as well be the idiot with the dice, but I want it noted that I am not happy about this, and I will be complaining the entire time, and I expect a pie afterward. He was the proof that you don't have to be chosen to matter. You don't have to be born into prophecy. You don't have to carry the weight of the world because the pattern decided you should. You can be a boy from nowhere. A boy with dirt on his boots and a stolen apple in his shirt and no particular reason to be important. And you can still stand in the way of the dark, and you can still hold the line, and you can still win. Not because you were destined to, but because you decided to, because you looked at the thing coming and you said no, and you meant it, and you didn't move. And that was enough. That was always enough. That is the only thing that has ever been enough. And the dice are still spinning. They never stopped. They're spinning right now, in some tavern in some town that doesn't have a name worth remembering, in a corner where the light is warm and the ale is cold, and the woman across the table is cheating, and the man with the one good eye is pretending not to notice because losing to her is the only game he ever wanted to lose. He's not famous there. No one knows his name. No one knows what he did. No one knows about the spear, or the generals, or the scar on his neck, or the shadow on the left side of his vision. He's just a man. Just Matt. Just the one who rolls the bones and grins and says, your turn, and means it, means the whole world in it, means I'm here, I'm alive, I'm small, I'm free, and I don't owe anyone anything except this one roll. This one. Laugh. This one ordinary, unremarkable, perfect evening. And somewhere, in the space between one turning and the next, a fox is laughing, soft and low, the way something laughs when it has won a game no one else knew was being played. And Matt Cauthon, who never wanted to be a hero, who never wanted to be remembered, who never wanted to be anything except a boy with dice and a pie and a long golden afternoon with no responsibilities and no one looking. For him, sits in the corner and rolls and wins and smiles and does not look back. He never looked back. And the dice still spin.